Well, good morning, Northside. I'm excited to be here on a challenging day after my Longhorns just didn't have what it took. Even though I was praying. Okay, y'all can stop. Enough. This is church, guys. With that, has anybody ever experienced, I just want to kind of gauge the audience for a little bit. Anybody ever experienced a loss of senses? Now, before you point fingers at your wife or your husband or your kids or a friend, I mean like one of your five senses, right? Taste, touch, smell, or that's the same. Anybody ever? Okay, cool. If you've ever been in that scenario, I know, Nicole, you mentioned something a few weeks back about the loss of taste and smell and how horrible it is. You know it's disorienting. It throws you for a loop. When you don't have something that 9 times out of 10 we take for granted, right? Like nobody thinks of their ability to smell or taste as anything special until you lose it. And then it's really disorienting. It throws you for a loop. I realize, like, for those of you who don't know, I enjoy cooking. I enjoy cooking a lot. I love cooking, specifically Mexican food that reminds me of growing up. And so my wife also loves me cooking Mexican food as well. And so last night even, we were cooking enchiladas. We had the Terwilligers over, and they didn't know that I was going to mention them in the message because I just threw it in. But we had them over, and in that specific recipe, I really rely on my sense of smell and my sense of taste, but more my sense of smell. When I'm making an enchilada sauce, I waft the sauce to see if it's burned or see if it's too weak or to see what needs to be added. And I'll taste it occasionally to make sure it's just right. And I happen to learn how to cook from my mom, who for some reason there's this mom trait that nothing is ever measured. I don't know if that's just my mom. I know it's not just my mom. You guys probably have moms out there or grandmothers who, when you ask, hey, how did you make that? What did you do? How much flour? They're like, I don't know, mijo. They probably don't say mijo, but I don't know, mijo. I just do like this. And I'm always like, Mom, what is this? How much is that? How much goes into that? And she's like, I don't know, just look. And I'm like, whatever. So that's how I learned how to cook, is not measuring anything. I don't measure anything. And a couple of weeks ago, I had lost my sense of taste and smell, and I was cooking dinner, and I was making this dish called carne picada. Let's say it all at the count of 3. No, I'm just joking. Carne picada is a dish. It's a Mexican meat and potato stew type dish, and my family loves it. I grew up loving that dish. I loved eating that. It's a comfort food, and my family happens to really love it, and I love it because it's super easy to make. My boy loves it, Levi, because that means more often than not, I'm making homemade tortillas with it. And so he's like a tortilla eating machine. Like if he sees me bust out my rolling pin and flour, that boy's like, we mean business. Like I'm sticking around. Like this is something to get excited about. So a couple of weeks ago, I was making food. I got the tortillas done. I was making this stew, and I got to a critical part where I needed to see what it tasted like, to see what needed to be added. And when I dipped the spoon in and took a sample, I was horrified because I was like, this tastes like nothing. I can't smell. I don't know what this tastes like. What is going on? And I looked at Sharon and I was like, listen, this could either be the best food you've ever had, or you will want to puke your guts out because I have no idea what this tastes like. And let me tell you, you really don't know what to do next. You don't know what your next step is when you lose something that you often take for granted. Now, if you're wondering, what does Mexican dishes have to do with Mark chapter 10? Like, what's going on? How are you going to tie this in? I want to talk about a danger, really what I feel is the greatest danger that the church faces, and really the people of God have faced throughout generations. And it's this very real illness called spiritual blindness. Spiritual blindness. It's something that I believe is not anything new. It's not anything brought on by modern times. I believe that spiritual blindness has plagued God's people ever since the beginning of time. It's nothing new. And I believe it's probably one of the most deadly things that someone could suffer from. spiritual blindness. It's disorienting. You can't move forward with any sort of confidence. You lack an understanding of reality. It's huge. It's a big deal. But what is spiritual blindness? What does that mean? I've defined it for us today, and this isn't a all-inclusive definition, but it's the best I could come up with. Justin could probably do a better job. But here we go. Let's try it. Spiritual blindness is the inability to understand who Jesus is and what he desires to do in this world. That's what spiritual blindness is. Now, here's why I believe spiritual blindness is so deadly. And I'm a visual person, so I developed this slide for us who are visual learners. Spiritual blindness oftentimes leads to a hardened heart. And a hardened heart is a heart that is calloused and lacks any ability to sense and feel truth, to know what way to go, to know the next step. And oftentimes a hardened heart leads in to a distorted view of self. What happens when spiritual blindness sets in leads to a hardened heart, and then your view of yourself becomes inflated. Oftentimes, with a hardened heart, you start thinking your condition as a follower of Jesus is actually better than in reality what it is. You start thinking more of yourself than you actually are. You are in a bad state, but you can't see it because you have a distorted view of self. And then that leads into not walking in purpose. And what I mean by not walking in purpose is when you have a distorted view of yourself, you lack an understanding, you're spiritually blind. You may think you're following Jesus, you're walking in his will, you're walking in the way that he wants you to go, but in all reality, you're missing the mark, walking away from purpose instead of in it, which leads to the last really sad state, a wasted life. A life that's been spent in the wrong direction, a life that's missed the point, because of a lack of purpose. This is why I believe this is so dangerous. This spiritual blindness is so dangerous. And we're going to look in Mark chapter 10, verse 32 through 52 this morning. And we're going to uncover what I believe what Jesus does when he encounters spiritual blindness for himself and what our response to this blindness should be. So let me give you a little background before we dive into what's happening, because I believe Mark's actually setting up kind of a trend that starts back in Mark chapter 8. In Mark chapter 8, Mark is very, I believe, brilliant in rising really to the top the idea of this trend of blindness and what Jesus does when he interacts with it. So in Mark 8, something happens that's amazing, right? Jesus feeds the 4,000. Jesus does something miraculous. And then there's this trend. Jesus does something amazing. He tells a hard truth. In Mark chapter 8, the hard truth was, for the first time, Jesus is letting his disciples know, hey, listen, I am going to die. I'm going to suffer. He's telling them what his end is going to be. And then 3 days later, I will rise. However, the disciples in spiritual blindness totally miss the point. They don't understand it. And so there's this trend that starts where Jesus does something amazing. He tells them a hard truth. They react with spiritual blindness and then repeat. In Mark chapter 9, we see it happen again and again. Jesus, who has an interaction with this father who's desperate to have his son healed of these unclean spirits. He casts out these spirits and then tells a second time, predicts his death, right? And again, it's responded to not by, oh, I wonder what that means, or help us understand. No, the disciples instead, in spiritual blindness, argue about which one of them is going to be the greatest. And then it repeats. And this is where we find ourselves in Mark chapter 10, verse 32. If you want to join me, it says this in verse 32, they were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and he told them what was going to happen to him. We're going to go up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? Now, I got to admit, this part and maybe you feel the same way, when you read this part, it's infuriating. It's really frustrating because here's what's happening. Jesus is explaining what's about to happen in view of the city. He's pointing to the city of Jerusalem. He's saying, listen, I'm about to die. I'm going to be handed over. I'm going to be spit on. Like all these horrible details. He's pouring out his heart about what he's about to face. Again, being as clear as possible. He's giving great details for the third time. And what is the response of those closest to Jesus? Those who have walked with him, those who have been with him, what is their response? Their response is to demand that Jesus do whatever they ask him to do. Now, I don't know about you, but for me as a parent, this resonates because I feel like everyone has experienced moments where you've asked, does that person have the ability to read the room? Like, do they not understand what's going on? Like, what horrible timing. And if you're a parent in the room or if you've been around kids, you know that kids have a horrible sense of timing, right? Like a few weeks ago, in our house, we're normal people for the most part. We're normal people who have stressful weeks. And this particular day, we were both on edge. Sharon and I were just like done. We were like, it's bedtime. Anybody ever wake up with their kids like in the morning? You're like, it's time to go to bed. Like, amen, right? Like this was one of those days. And here's what happened. Sharon works hard, has a job, works really hard, and then she has to come home and deal with us, right? Us being me and my children, and I'm going to own them for a minute because it's me. But she comes in, and we have loads of laundry. Anybody have laundry that just overflows and it just never gets done? Like it's just constant. Your washer's going 24 hours a day. If you don't know what that is, bless you. But for us, there's laundry, always laundry. And here's the deal with me and Sharon. I hate folding and sorting laundry. I really hate it. Like I won't do it. In college, I pretty much just left it in a basket and I ironed every morning. I know that's weird, but I did it. But Sharon hates putting up laundry. She doesn't mind folding it. So we have this cool little balance where she folds all the laundry and sorts it and I have to put it up. Now, if I'm being honest, more often than not, the laundry stays folded neatly on the ottoman and on the couch until we have company over, right? So Terwilligers, there was laundry on our couch before you showed up. But more often than not, that's what happens. And this particular day, Sharon is stressed to the max. She has loads of laundry. She's busy. Our daughter, who's blessed with the spiritual gift of stubbornness, and she just needs prayer. She was just having one of her days, right? Where she's just like, I tell her no, and she goes, right? Like, just like wants to fight me for no reason. And when she wasn't crying, she was whining, and she was just having a tough day. And so that automatically put us on edge. And then she thought it'd be hilarious to knock over the towers of neatly folded clothes and keep doing it, no matter how many times we asked her not to do that. For some reason, a 1-year-old just can't process those requests. And so this is the situation. We just finished eating lunch. It's a tense situation. One more thing happens and I'm leaving and Sharon's leaving and we don't know if we're going to come back for our children, right? That's where we're at. My son comes in. Bless Levi. He comes in, walks straight up to my wife, and goes, Mom, I want a snack. Literally like that. Mom, I want a snack. Not, can I have a snack? Not, Mom, in your brilliance, could you please open the fridge and give me a snack? Nothing like that. Mom, I want a snack. To which we just got done eating lunch and he didn't eat. So I'm already like, I told you to eat. You're going to eat that for breakfast, right? Becoming my dad, basically. And so I am like, oh, what's going to happen? She's like, excuse me, do you have a different way of asking that? And this is the level of Sharon where I'm like, oh boy, you better, your next words, choose them carefully. He's like, what? I want a snack. Now, my boy's sweet, but he has some flaws. That was bad timing. That was not reading the room, because the look that came over Sharon's eyes, I was like, I need to get her out of this house into a Starbucks and a Hobby Lobby stat for her to have her spirit refreshed and come back new and remembering that she follows Jesus, because she was like, and I literally told Levi, I was like, Levi, if you know what's good for you, get out of our sight. Like, I literally just told him, like, get out, just go. And he was like, I just wanted a snack. I don't know, it's a big deal. And I'm like, oh my goodness. But listen, when we hear a story like that, we get it. They're kids, right? Levi doesn't know any better. He didn't mean anything. Like, it's part of growing up. It's part of learning. These are grown men. These are disciples. This is James and John. They've been following Jesus, and they hear Jesus pouring out his heart, and he's telling them all the details of what's about to happen for them in their salvation and the rest of the world. This is the situation. And what's their response? Hey, Jesus, we want you to do whatever we ask. Like, cool, shut up about whatever you got going on, but we want you to do whatever we ask, so we need you to listen up. This is their response to Jesus. And pay attention to how Jesus responds to them. I don't think it would have been the way I would have throat chopped them personally, but Jesus responds with them saying, what can I do for you? What do you want me to do for you? It's going to come up again here in just a little bit, but this question is a powerful response because it illustrates Jesus' heart and the heart that he really desires for his followers to have as well. This heart of service, of pouring out. His disciples are missing the point. They don't understand. In fact, every time that they've brought up, every time that Jesus has predicted his death, he has been met with his disciples saying, no, that's not right. That's incorrect. We don't understand that. Back to what we want. What's our position going to look like? Where are we going to sit in this new kingdom? What's our end going to be? What do you have for us? Essentially, James and John are asking for status. They're asking for power. They're asking for privilege. In that time when a king reigned, there was status. Just like kind of today, when you go to a wedding, your status is really measured by where you're sitting at, right? Like if you show up to a wedding of someone you like used to go to high school with, and you haven't talked in 10 years, and you sit in the front row, there's going to be a problem, right? Like your status doesn't equal your placement. Like we have that same process today, but this is what the disciples are worried about. Totally blind to the fact that Jesus has been clear and is continuing to be clear. He is not coming to set up a kingdom like they are familiar with. And so the disciples respond to Jesus. They ask this question, and Jesus says, hey, listen, you don't understand what you're talking about. You don't know what you're asking. Can you bear this cup that I'm about to hold? Like, can you be baptized with the baptism that I will be baptized with? And the disciples ignorantly say, of course. Now, when Jesus says, can you have this cup? Can you be baptized with this baptism? What he's saying is he's referencing the burden that is on him right now. He's referencing, hey, listen, I'm about to go through something. Can you handle what I have to do? Can you follow in my footsteps? Which, by evidence of, if we fast forward to the crucifixion and the disciples are nowhere to be found, they can't. In fact, he's just told them, I'm about to be spit on. I'm about to be delivered to the Gentiles, mocked, and I'm going to die. And so he's asking them, can you handle this burden? And the disciples, blind, say, James and John say, sure, we got this. James and John are not only blind to who Jesus is, and this has led to a hardness of heart, but now their view of themselves has been distorted. They see themselves as being able to handle more than what they can actually handle. They see themselves as owed and entitled to the highest places that Jesus has to offer. This has caused a distorted sense of self, and so the disciples continue to miss what Jesus actually came to do. They're still expecting a kingdom on this world. They're still expecting Jesus to overthrow Rome and to establish a new kingdom where there would be places of honor for them to sit, totally missing the point that the Messiah has come to give his life for humanity. Now, it's easy to beat up on James and John in this situation. In fact, it's easy to beat up on all of the disciples. But the truth of the matter is, James and John actually represent humanity, right? Like, we're no different than James and John. We're caught up, oftentimes, so caught up in the world's cares and the priorities that this world has, so stuck in our own world that we're often blind and willfully ignorant to what God desires to do in our lives and in the lives around us. We can relate to where John and James are at. Jesus continues in verse 42. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them, but not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus is again emphasizing his kingdom is not like what they're expecting. The disciples have constantly wanted to fit Jesus in to their idea of what a Messiah was. No, Jesus, we don't care about you dying. That can't happen. In fact, every time that Jesus has predicted his death, it's been met by ignorance. The first time, Peter responds by taking Jesus aside and rebuking him, chewing Jesus out, saying, Jesus, you don't know what you're doing. What are you talking about? That's not the Messiah we signed up for. That's not the Messiah we've been waiting for. What are you talking about? And Jesus' response to him was, get behind me, Satan, which is a really good comeback. But it's always been met. The second time is met with, what's our power? What's our position? Who's going to be the greatest? Every time Jesus has talked about the reality of his kingdom, it's been met by, nope, that doesn't fit what we want. That doesn't match up with what we had in mind. Trying to bend Jesus into something that he will not conform to. This is the danger of spiritual blindness. Not only does it harden our own hearts, not only does it create a distorted view of self, but it leaves us walking not in purpose. It leaves us walking out of purpose. And that eventually leads to wasting our lives. How? Because when we don't have a clear understanding of who Jesus is, when we aren't seeing him in all of his entirety, we can't know what we're called to or how to live and walk. When we have a muddled view and a muddled understanding of who Jesus is and what he's come to do, we can't possibly walk in the purpose that he's laid out for us. And oftentimes it's those who are closest to him that miss it the most. Guys, the saddest situation to ever find yourself in, and I hope that nobody finds themselves in this position, I know I have a time or two, is to find yourself thinking that your proximity to Jesus translates into alignment with Jesus. Is to catch yourself thinking that because you go to church, because you do everything right, you live a moral life, you have a good marriage, you don't watch really bad movies or whatever it might be, you check all the boxes to think that your proximity to Jesus, the fact that you're in the church building every week, means that your heart is aligned with the heart of Jesus. These are the disciples. This is what the disciples are struggling with. They've been walking with Jesus for years. They're close to him. They've experienced what he's experienced, and still they think that they are aligned with Jesus, but really, in reality, they are so far from the heart of Jesus. It's the danger of spiritual blindness. And we're susceptible to it. Everyone is susceptible to it. And so what happens is we spend our whole lives pursuing the wrong thing, wasting the life to the full that Jesus actually came to give us, and settling for something that we hope will fulfill us, whether that's power, whether that's notoriety, whether that's advancement. A lot of times we think we know the will of God, and we're so far from it. And the story continues, and this is where it really gets real. And Mark actually is contrasting again this trend of blindness shown by the disciples, and then he's going to use an outsider, again, an outsider who isn't really thought to have gotten it. He's going to use that outsider as an illustration of what a proper response to Jesus is in blindness. The story continues. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. This is the situation where Jesus and his disciples find themselves. They're leaving the town of Jericho. There's a beggar there. His lot in life is simply that. He's been a beggar for years. He's unable to see physically, and so his lot in life is sitting there begging as a means for a living. In society's eyes, he's not worth much. This is a guy who gets begrudgingly thrown change and uses his cloak to gather whatever loose change someone donated. This is a guy who he doesn't even have a name. He's not even referenced in Scripture by name. He's referenced as basically the equivalent of calling Levi, instead of Levi, hey, son of Michael, which might be cool. Occasionally, by the way, just thought of that. It sounds really grand. But Levi, like to be robbed of your name, think about that for a second. To be robbed of your name, to not even be referred to in your society by name, but just as that blind guy that's the son of Timaeus, that couldn't amount to much because he's blind. The guy that sits there and begs. The irony of this is that he has a 20/20 vision of who Jesus is. When he's calling out for Jesus, Son of David, this Son of David language actually has two perspectives. In historical Jewish thought, the Son of David, all throughout Scripture, has been referred to as the Messiah who's going to subdue God's enemies. But the other perspective on it is that it's reference to the fact that a Messiah will come and show mercy to his people, restore and redeem, and bring healing to his people. And so when Bartimaeus shouts out to Jesus, he's shouting out with an understanding of who God is, who Jesus is. You're the guy who's going to show me mercy. And he continues. In verse 48, many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and called him. And so they called the blind man, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Which, by the way, this is the worst. Sometimes God's people can really just frustrate you. Am I right? Right? Like, these are people, this is who Jesus came to heal, to restore, and he's shouting for help, pleading, have mercy. And the followers who are following Jesus are like, hey, shut up. He's too busy. He ain't got time for you. Quiet down. Just go back to where you're at. We're not bothering you. Don't bother us. Go back. And then when Jesus says, hey, call him, because his pleas reach Jesus' ears and he stops in his tracks, all of a sudden they come up, hey, cheer up, bro. It's good. He wants to see you now. Good job. And it's like, you guys are the worst. Anyways, this is crazy. Imagine the scene. You're desperate. You know a rabbi's coming who brings healing, and you shout and plead, and everyone tells you to be quiet. This is such an interesting contrast. I mean, think about it. The hearts of the physically able, the people who are able to see, is contrasted with the heart of a spiritually vibrant, can see clearly, but physically blind. And what we see is that, again, the disciples are missing it. They're missing the whole purpose of why Jesus is here. The person that they are shutting up is the person Jesus actually came to meet with. He's the person Jesus came to bring healing and to restore. But Jesus asks the question to Bartimaeus once again. We see this question come up in verse 51. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asks. And the blind man's response, I think, is very telling of what our response should be to spiritual blindness. The blind man simply says, let me see. In other translations, he says, let me regain my sight. That's all I ask. Let me see. He's not asking for position. He's not asking for power. He's not asking for prestige. He's not asking for notoriety. He's not coming at it with a misaligned heart. He knows that the Messiah is supposed to bring healing and mercy, and he's asking in alignment, Jesus, just let me see. This references also Mark's trend in pointing out the father who is desperate to have his son healed of unclean spirits. When he comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, I believe, help my unbelief. There's this desperation there in these two accounts that Mark tells. This desperation illuminates this idea that, man, the heart of the desperate person who understands who Jesus is, who sees clearly, who isn't plagued with spiritual blindness, they come up to God and they say, hey, listen, help us see. We're blind in certain areas. Help us to see. This dad that in Mark chapter 9 is talked about, this dad comes up and says, Jesus, I have faith, but help my unbelief. I believe in you, but I'm struggling. Help me. And so when we think about spiritual blindness and we ask ourselves, how do we fight it? How do we combat spiritual blindness in our lives? I believe the answer is clearly shown in Bartimaeus' story and also in the desperate father just a few chapters back. And it's really complicated. I want you guys to brace yourselves, okay? Here it is. Here's how we fight spiritual blindness. We ask Jesus to let us see. It's nothing profound. It's nothing earth-shattering. But we follow Bartimaeus' lead. We ask. When we lack sight, we ask. We ask Jesus to let us see, like Justin referenced last week, entering the kingdom is easier than we think, but it costs more than we realize. The same thing is true with spiritual blindness. It's super simple. Regaining sight is super simple, but it has a cost. What's the cost? You got to lay down the desires that you have. You have to throw off whatever identity, whatever thing is holding you back. You have to lay aside any desire for position, for status, any desire to have anything out of alignment with Jesus' will for your life. And you ask God to let you see. This is what kept the disciples from seeing Jesus for who he was. It wasn't because they were bad people. It wasn't because they were stupid. It was simply because they just lacked the ability to ask Jesus, let us see. Not once in their misunderstanding of what Jesus was talking about did they come up to Jesus and say, Jesus, we want to believe. We believe you're the Messiah. Help us, though. We're falling short. We're blind. Help us. There's something about the heart of the desperate that leaves room, as we're going to talk about, leaves room for understanding. So what does asking Jesus to let us see look like today? What steps do we take? Just real quick. There's a few ways to do this. The first one is to surrender to Jesus. Maybe you're in here or watching online and you've never surrendered to Jesus. You're spiritually blind because you've never decided to cross that threshold of faith. This first step is surrendering to him, coming to him and laying down our lives and saying, Jesus, I don't know what to do. I'm wandering around in the dark. Please bring light to my vision. Help me to see. The second thing we do is we admit that we are blind. We have to come to grips when we are in situations where we don't understand what God is doing, where we don't understand what Jesus is doing. We have to admit our blindness. And the third is we remain desperate. There's something about keeping and maintaining a desperate heart that allows room for God to give us the understanding that we need. We remain desperate. We practice desperation in our lives. We remove ourselves from any desires for anything other than what God has for us. Jesus isn't just something that we add to our lives. He's the whole thing. And we remain hungry and desperate for more understanding. Jesus, I don't understand what you're doing, but help me understand. Jesus, I can't see you in this moment, so help me see. Jesus, I'm desperate. Like this desperate father. I want to encourage you this afternoon, read the account of the desperate father and feel with the desperation that he's asking Jesus, help me in my unbelief. I hope that that's a prayer for all of us. And lastly, we need community. We need to commit to community. Oftentimes, Jesus' answer to letting us see is in his people. We commit to community. This is why we champion connection groups here at Northside. It's why we're grateful to have Nate leading our charge to be connected and be in groups and be plugged in. Why? Because we need other followers to point out blind spots in our life. We need people, as we're journeying through this life of faith, to point out areas that we are lacking sight. We need community. So church, I want to ask, may we fight spiritual blindness at every opportunity. May we understand that we need a clearer sight of who Jesus is and what he wants to do. And when we find blindness creeping into our lives, may we attack it at every opportunity. And may we be courageous enough to ask Jesus to let us see, understanding that true sight comes when we align our hearts with Jesus. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this day. I thank you for giving us your word. And God, I pray that you would help us to live lives that are not just chasing our own desires, but God, may we live lives that are solely wanting to understand who you are and what you're wanting to do and how we play a part in that. God, may you open our hearts, our minds, and our eyes to see you for who you are, and may we fall in love with you with every day that passes. In Jesus' name, amen.